The crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across the elegant Manhattan restaurant, their radiance dancing off wine glasses and polished silverware. Saturday evening brought the usual crowd of well-dressed patrons to Romano's, one of the city's most prestigious dining establishments. Laughter mingled with the soft clinking of champagne flutes, creating a symphony of affluence and sophistication that filled the air like expensive perfume. In the corner booth near the window, Jack Mitchell sat across from his 10-year-old daughter Emily, watching her eyes light up as she carefully cut her chicken parmesan. At 42, Jack carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who had learned to be both father and mother to his child. His calloused hands, evidence of long days working construction, seemed out of place holding the delicate wineglass, but his eyes held nothing but tenderness as he watched Emily navigate her oversized dinner with determined precision. This monthly dinner tradition had become sacred to them both. After Emily's mother passed away 3 years ago, Jack had promised his daughter that no matter how tight money got, they would always have their special Saturday night out. Tonight, like every other, Emily wore her best dress, a simple blue outfit she had picked out herself, while Jack had traded his work boots for the only pair of dress shoes he owned. The restaurant buzzed with conversations about stock prices, vacation homes in the Hamptons, and upcoming charity galas. Jack felt the familiar weight of being out of place among these people, but Emily's happiness made every dollar worth it. She had spent the entire week talking about their dinner, asking questions about the menu, practicing her table manners with the seriousness of a diplomat preparing for a state dinner. Across the dining room, near the mahogany bar where business executives nursed their whiskey, a young woman sat alone at a small table. Sarah Collins, 28 years old, wore a charcoal gray business suit that spoke of corporate success, but her posture suggested anything but comfort. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a professional bun, though several strands had escaped to frame her pale face. She kept checking her phone, her green eyes darting nervously toward the entrance every few minutes. Sarah had not wanted to come here tonight. The text message that afternoon had been clear enough: meet at Romano's at 8 o'clock, or face the consequences. As a senior financial analyst at Meridian Industries, she had stumbled upon something she was never meant to see. Numbers that did not add up. Accounts that existed in shadows. Money that flowed through channels designed to hide its true purpose. The weight of that knowledge sat heavy in her chest as she sipped her untouched wine, knowing that somewhere in this room, the men who had threatened her were watching, waiting for the right moment to corner her again. She had already tried going to her supervisor, only to discover that the corruption reached higher than she had imagined. Tonight, she was trapped between her conscience and her safety, with nowhere left to run. Emily was in the middle of telling her father about her science project when she noticed the woman at the bar. Something about Sarah's nervous energy caught the little girl's attention, the way children often notice things that adults miss or choose to ignore. Emily had always been sensitive to people's emotions, a trait that both worried and amazed Jack in equal measure. The restaurant's atmosphere shifted subtly when two men in expensive suits approached Sarah's table. To most observers, they looked like business associates joining a colleague for drinks. But Emily saw the way Sarah's shoulders tensed. The way she pressed herself back in her chair as if trying to disappear. The men were both large, well-groomed, with the kind of confident bearing that came from never being told no. Their smiles never reached their eyes. Marcus Donnelly and Vincent Torres had been handling Meridian's personnel issues for over 5 years. They specialized in making problems disappear, whether those problems were whistleblowers, journalists, or idealistic employees who asked too many questions. Tonight, Sarah Collins represented all three. As they settled into chairs on either side of her, effectively trapping her at the small table, Marcus leaned forward with predatory charm. His voice was low enough that nearby diners could not hear, but Emily, blessed with the acute hearing of childhood, caught fragments of their conversation. Words like consequences and unfortunate accidents drifted across the dining room like smoke. Sarah's face had gone white, her hands trembling as she clutched her napkin. She tried to stand, but Vincent's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with enough force to make her wince. To anyone watching casually, it might have looked like a friendly gesture, a colleague helping her to her seat. But Emily saw the fear in Sarah's eyes, the way she bit her lip to keep from crying out. The dining room continued its elegant dance of conversation and consumption, the other patrons either oblivious to the drama unfolding before them or expertly trained in the art of willful blindness. In places like Romano's, people learned early that involvement in other people's problems was a luxury they could not afford. Jack followed his daughter's gaze and felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the predatory body language of the two men. He had seen that look before, in the faces of bullies who picked on smaller kids in school, in the eyes of men who thought their size and wealth gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. His construction background had taught him to read danger in all its forms, and every instinct he possessed was now screaming warnings. Emily tugged gently at her father's sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of her innocent heart. "Daddy, can we help her?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge over a chasm. Jack looked into his daughter's earnest face, seeing his late wife's compassion reflected in those wide brown eyes. In that moment, he understood that his answer would shape not just the next few minutes, but the kind of man his daughter would believe him to be for the rest of her life. Every logical part of his mind urged caution. These were clearly dangerous men, the kind who had resources and connections that a working-class single father could never match. Getting involved would put both him and Emily at risk, potentially making them targets of whatever organization these men represented. The smart play was to finish dinner, pay the check, and walk away. But as he watched Sarah's desperate attempt to free herself from Vincent's grip, Jack realized that some choices transcended logic. His daughter was watching, learning what courage looked like, discovering whether her father was the kind of man who stood up for others, or the kind who looked away when it mattered most. Jack placed his napkin on the table and stood slowly, his 6-foot frame unfolding with deliberate precision. He was not the largest man in the restaurant, but years of construction work had given him the solid build of someone who earned his living with his hands. More importantly, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Emily's eyes followed him as he crossed the dining room, weaving between tables of oblivious diners who continued their conversations about art gallery openings and vacation plans. The little girl remained seated, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap, but her face shone with pride and terror in equal measure. Jack approached Sarah's table with measured steps, his expression calm but his jaw set with determination. The two men looked up at him with the mild annoyance of predators interrupted during a kill, their eyes calculating as they assessed this new variable in their carefully controlled equation. "Excuse me," Jack said, his voice carrying the steady authority of someone accustomed to being heard over construction site noise. "The lady looks like she could use some air. Maybe you gentlemen could give her some space." Marcus smiled, the expression cold enough to freeze wine. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, friend. This is a private conversation between colleagues. From where I'm standing, it looks like harassment." Jack's voice remained level, but something in his tone made nearby diners begin to take notice. "I'm asking nicely. Let her go." Vincent's grip tightened on Sarah's wrist, making her gasp softly. The sound cut through Jack like a blade, reminding him of every time he had failed to protect someone who needed it. "Not tonight. Not with his daughter watching." "You need to mind your own business," Vincent said, his voice carrying the casual menace of a man accustomed to intimidation. "Walk away while you still can." Sarah's eyes met Jack's across the table, and in them he saw a desperate gratitude mixed with terror. She was trapped, cornered by men who clearly had no intention of letting her leave until they got what they wanted. Whatever information she possessed, whatever threat she represented to their organization, they were prepared to handle it with the kind of quiet violence that money could buy and silence could hide. Jack took another step forward, close enough now that he could smell Marcus's expensive cologne and see the calculation in both men's eyes. They were measuring him, deciding whether he represented a serious threat or just another obstacle to be removed. He could feel the attention of other diners beginning to focus on their table, though none had yet decided whether to intervene or simply enjoy the unexpected entertainment. "Last chance," Jack said quietly. "Let her go." The explosion of violence that followed seemed to happen in slow motion and at lightning speed simultaneously. Vincent released Sarah's wrist only to reach inside his jacket, but Jack was already moving, years of construction site reflexes serving him well. His right hand shot out, gripping Vincent's wrist and preventing whatever weapon he was reaching for from clearing its holster. Marcus lunged across the table, his weight and momentum carrying both him and Jack backward into an adjacent table, sending glasses and plates crashing to the floor in a symphony of breaking crystal. The restaurant erupted in screams and shouts, as elegantly dressed patrons scrambled to get out of the way, some fleeing toward the exits, while others stood frozen in shocked fascination. Jack twisted sharply, using Marcus's momentum against him to send the larger man stumbling into a nearby chair. Vincent was on his feet now, having freed his hand, but Jack was already inside his reach, delivering a sharp elbow to the man's solar plexus that doubled him over with a whoosh of expelled air. Sarah had scrambled away from the table, pressing herself against the wall as she watched this ordinary-looking father transform into something fierce and protective. She could see Emily across the room, the little girl standing on her chair now, her face a mixture of fear and amazement as she watched her father fight for a stranger's safety. The restaurant's security team finally appeared, though their hesitation suggested they were uncertain about whose side they should take. In places like Romano's, wealth and influence often mattered more than right and wrong, and these guards had been trained to protect the establishment's reputation above all else. Jack found himself facing both attackers simultaneously, his construction worker strength serving him well, but his lack of formal training beginning to show. Marcus had recovered from his stumble, and was advancing with the practiced movements of someone who had done this many times before. Vincent was straightening up, his hand once again moving toward his jacket with obvious intent. The crowd of onlookers had formed a rough circle around the conflict. Some recording with their phones, while others called for security or police. The restaurant's manager appeared at the edge of the chaos, wringing his hands as he watched his establishment's carefully cultivated atmosphere of refined elegance dissolve into something that belonged on a street corner, rather than in a place where entrees cost more than many people's weekly salary. Jack ducked a wild swing from Marcus and managed to grab a heavy wine bottle from a nearby table, wielding it like a club to keep both men at bay. He was breathing hard now, adrenaline coursing through his system as he tried to protect himself while keeping both attackers away from Sarah, who remained pressed against the wall with nowhere to run. "Stop this immediately." The restaurant manager's voice cut through the chaos, though his authority seemed questionable given the circumstances. "Security is calling the police. Everyone needs to calm down." But Marcus and Vincent showed no signs of backing down. These were men who operated in a world where witnesses could be silenced and evidence could disappear, where money and connections provided immunity from consequences that would destroy ordinary people. They had clearly decided that Jack represented a threat that needed to be eliminated permanently. The tide of the fight shifted when Emily's voice rang out across the restaurant, clear and strong despite her fear. "That's my daddy. He's helping that lady." The simple declaration seemed to galvanize the other diners, reminding them that they were watching a father protect a stranger while his child looked on. Several men in the crowd stepped forward, their movements subtle but unmistakable. Whatever else these people might be, they were not going to stand by and watch a man fighting to protect someone get overwhelmed by obvious criminals. Marcus seemed to sense the change in the room's atmosphere. His eyes darted around the crowd, reading the hostile faces and calculating odds that were no longer in his favor. Vincent, still struggling to catch his breath, followed his partner's gaze and came to the same conclusion. "This isn't over," Marcus said, his voice carrying a promise rather than a threat. He straightened his jacket and smoothed his hair, transforming back into the image of a respectable businessman with practiced ease. "We know where to find you." The two men pushed through the crowd of onlookers and disappeared into the night, leaving behind broken glass, overturned furniture, and a room full of shaken witnesses. Jack stood in the center of the destruction, still holding the wine bottle, his chest heaving as adrenaline slowly gave way to the realization of what had just happened. Emily broke free from the crowd and ran to her father, wrapping her small arms around his waist with fierce intensity. "Daddy, are you okay? Are you hurt?" Jack dropped the bottle and knelt to his daughter's level, checking her for injuries even though she had been nowhere near the fight. His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed her hair, the enormity of what he had just done beginning to sink in. He had not just intervened in a random altercation. 25, he had made enemies of people who clearly had the resources and inclination to make his life very difficult. Sarah approached them slowly, her face still pale, but her eyes bright with unshed tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice hoarse with emotion. "You saved my life tonight. I don't know how to repay that." "You don't owe me anything," Jack replied, standing but keeping one protective hand on Emily's shoulder. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" Sarah shook her head, though she was obviously shaken. "I'm okay, thanks to you, but those men, they're not going to forgive this. You need to be careful. They work for some very dangerous people." The restaurant manager appeared at Jack's elbow, his expression a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Sir, I want to thank you for what you did, but I'm afraid I'll need to ask you to speak with the police when they arrive. And I'm sorry, but given the circumstances, I think it would be best if you and your daughter left once you've given your statement." Jack nodded, understanding the position the man was in. Places like Romano's survived by maintaining their reputation for safety and exclusivity. A violent confrontation, no matter how justified, was exactly the kind of publicity they could not afford. He and Emily would not be welcome back, but that seemed like a small price to pay for doing what was right. As they waited for the police to arrive, Emily stayed close to her father's side, her small hand gripping his with surprising strength. She kept looking up at him with something approaching awe, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. In her young mind, the man who helped her with homework and made her breakfast every morning had just revealed himself to be capable of genuine heroism. The police officers who responded were professional, but clearly overwhelmed by the conflicting accounts they received from witnesses. Some described Jack as a violent aggressor who had attacked two innocent businessmen. Others painted him as a hero who had rescued a woman from obvious predators. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere in the complexity of competing perspectives and incomplete information. Sarah provided her statement with careful precision, describing the threats she had received and the attempted assault that Jack had interrupted. But she was careful not to mention the specific details of what she had discovered at Meridian Industries, knowing that such information would only put more people at risk. By the time they were free to leave, it was nearly midnight. The restaurant had largely emptied, leaving only staff members cleaning up the debris from the evening's chaos. Jack and Emily walked out into the cool New York night, the city's familiar energy providing a strange comfort after the artificial atmosphere of Romano's. "Daddy," Emily said as they waited for a taxi, her voice small but clear in the night air. "I'm proud of you." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion as he looked down at his daughter's earnest face. In trying to teach her about courage and standing up for others, he had never imagined that the lesson would be quite so dramatic or costly. But seeing the pride and love in her eyes, he knew he would make the same choice again without hesitation. "Sometimes we have to do what's right even when it's scary," he told her, lifting her up so she could see over the crowd of late-night pedestrians. "That lady needed help, and we were the only ones who could give it to her." The taxi ride home was quiet, Emily dozing against her father's shoulder while Jack stared out at the passing streetlights and wondered what consequences his actions might bring. He had no illusions about the kind of men he had faced tonight. Marcus and Vincent represented something larger and more dangerous than simple street thugs, and their promise that this isn't over carried the weight of serious threat. As they climbed the stairs to their modest apartment in Queens, Jack found himself checking shadows and looking over his shoulder in ways that had never been necessary before. The comfortable routine of their simple life had been shattered by his decision to intervene, replaced by uncertainty and the constant awareness that danger might be lurking around any corner. Emily brushed her teeth and put on her pajamas with unusual solemnity, as if sensing that something fundamental had changed in their world. When Jack tucked her into bed, she looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than her 10 years. "Are those bad men going to come after us?" she asked with the direct honesty that children use to cut through adult pretense. Jack considered lying, offering the kind of reassuring platitudes that parents use to protect their children from harsh realities. But Emily had seen too much tonight to be satisfied with comfortable fiction. She deserved the truth, or at least as much of it as she could handle. "I don't know," he admitted, sitting on the edge of her bed and taking her small hand in both of his. "But if they do, we'll face it together. And we'll remember that we did the right thing tonight, no matter what happens next." Emily nodded with the gravity of someone much older, then surprised him by smiling. "I hope that lady is okay. Do you think we'll see her again?" "Maybe," Jack said, though he suspected that Sarah Collins would disappear back into whatever corporate world had created her problems in the first place. "But even if we don't, she'll remember that someone cared enough to help when she needed it most." After Emily fell asleep, Jack sat in his small living room, nursing a beer, and staring at the television without really seeing it. The local news was already covering the incident, though their version bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. According to the reporter, there had been an altercation at Romano's involving several patrons. With no mention of attempted assault or corporate corruption, the sanitized version of events told Jack everything he needed to know about the kind of people he was dealing with. Men like Marcus and Vincent did not just have money, they had influence, connections, and the ability to shape narratives to serve their purposes. By morning, he suspected the official story would paint him as a dangerous individual who had attacked innocent businessmen for no apparent reason. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, and Jack felt his blood chill as he read the simple words. "We know where you live." The message was followed by his home address, Emily's school, and his work site location. These people had not just identified him, they had mapped out his entire life in the span of a few hours, demonstrating a reach and efficiency that spoke to serious organizational backing. Jack deleted the message and turned off his phone, but the damage was done. Sleep would be impossible now, knowing that somewhere in the city, powerful people were planning their next move against him and his daughter. He had saved Sarah Collins tonight, but in doing so, he had painted a target on his own family that might prove impossible to remove. The next morning brought a media circus that transformed Jack from an anonymous construction worker into a reluctant public figure. Video footage from Romano's, captured by multiple diners' phones, had been uploaded and shared across social media platforms with lightning speed. By the time Jack woke up, his face was already appearing on morning news shows across the country. The coverage was sharply divided along predictable lines. Conservative outlets hailed him as a hero who had stood up to obvious criminals, while liberal commentators questioned his decision to resort to violence in a situation that might have been resolved peacefully. Missing from most reports was any substantive discussion of why Sarah Collins had been threatened in the first place. Emily watched the coverage with fascination while eating her cereal, pointing excitedly at the screen whenever her father appeared. She seemed unable to grasp the potential negative consequences of their sudden fame, seeing only the validation of her belief that her daddy was indeed a hero. "Look, Daddy. You're on television. Can I tell my teacher about this?" Jack turned off the television and knelt beside his daughter's chair, his expression serious, but gentle. "Emily, I need you to listen carefully. This is going to be a difficult time for us. Some people are going to say mean things about what happened last night. And others might try to hurt us because we helped that lady." Emily's eyes widened with concern, but she nodded with the solemnity of someone trying very hard to be grown up. "What do? We stay together, we stay safe, and we remember why we did what we did," Jack replied, kissing the top of her head. "And if anyone approaches you at school or anywhere else, you find a teacher or another adult you trust immediately. Promise me." The promise was barely given when Jack's phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah Collins's name, though he had no memory of giving her his number. When he answered, her voice was tight with urgency and fear. "Jack, I'm so sorry. I should have warned you last night, but I was too shaken to think clearly. The men who attacked me work for Meridian Industries, and they have resources you can't imagine. You and Emily are in serious danger because of what you did for me." "What kind of danger?" Jack asked. Though part of him already knew the answer. "The kind that doesn't make headlines," Sarah replied grimly. "These people specialize in making problems disappear. Accidents, sudden illnesses, home invasions gone wrong. They've perfected the art of eliminating threats while maintaining plausible deniability." Jack felt his stomach drop as the full implications of his situation became clear. He had not just made enemies, he had declared war on an organization with the resources to destroy him and everyone he cared about. And his 10-year-old daughter was now standing directly in the line of fire. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've been investigating Meridian for months. They're involved in money laundering, political corruption, and worse. What I found could bring down the entire organization, but only if I live long enough to testify." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that we're both targets now, whether we like it or not. But together, we might have a chance to expose them before they can silence us permanently. I have evidence, you have credibility, and between us, we might be able to get the authorities to take action." Jack looked across the room at Emily, who was now drawing pictures of the previous night's events with the cheerful innocence of childhood. The idea of putting her in even greater danger made his chest tighten with protective fury, but the alternative, waiting passively for Marcus and Vincent to choose their moment, seemed equally impossible. "What do you need me to do?" "Meet me this afternoon. There's a coffee shop on 5th Avenue called Brewster's. It's public enough to be safe, but quiet enough for us to talk. I'll bring copies of everything I've found, and we can decide how to proceed." After hanging up, Jack called his supervisor to request emergency leave, citing a family crisis that required his immediate attention. The man was understanding but concerned, having already seen the morning news coverage that featured his employee prominently. "Jack, I don't know what kind of trouble you've gotten yourself into, but be careful. The company can't afford to be associated with anything that might hurt our reputation." The message was clear enough. One more incident, and Jack would be looking for new employment. In the space of 12 hours, his decision to help a stranger had cost him his anonymity, his security, and potentially his livelihood. But as he looked at Emily's drawing of him as a superhero rescuing a princess, he found he could not regret the choice that had led to this moment. The coffee shop meeting with Sarah revealed the true scope of what they were facing. She arrived carrying a briefcase full of documents that painted a picture of corruption reaching into the highest levels of corporate and political power. Meridian Industries was not just a company, it was a criminal organization masquerading as a legitimate business, with tentacles reaching into government contracts, political campaigns, and international finance. "They've been using their legitimate business as a front for money laundering for at least 5 years, Sarah explained, spreading financial records across their small table. "But it goes deeper than that. They've been buying politicians, manipulating government contracts, and eliminating anyone who gets too close to the truth." Jack studied the documents with growing amazement and horror. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of millions of dollars flowing through shell companies and offshore accounts. All designed to hide the true source and destination of funds that should never have existed. "How did you find all this?" "I was assigned to audit their books as part of a routine compliance review," Sarah replied, her voice bitter with irony. "What I found was anything but routine. When I tried to report it through normal channels, I discovered that my own supervisor was involved. That's when the threats started. And last night was their final attempt to silence me quietly. When that failed, they'll escalate to more direct methods. We probably have days, maybe hours, before they decide that subtlety is no longer an option. Jack felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. By intervening at Romano's, he had not just saved Sarah's life, he had made himself a key witness to corporate crimes that could destroy lives and bring down governments. There was no walking away from this fight, no returning to the simple life he had built for himself and Emily. What's our next move? We go to the FBI, Sarah said firmly. I've been trying to build a case on my own, but after last night, I realize I need federal protection for both of us. These documents are copies. I've hidden the originals where Meridian can never find them. They spent the next hour planning their approach, Sarah explaining the intricacies of financial fraud, while Jack provided a working man's perspective on how to present their case in terms that law enforcement could understand and act upon. By the time they parted ways, they had agreed to meet at the federal building the following morning, armed with evidence and testimony that could change everything. Jack returned home to find Emily playing quietly in her room, but something in her demeanor immediately set off his paternal alarm bells. She was too quiet, too subdued, and there were tear tracks on her cheeks that she had tried unsuccessfully to hide. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "Some men came by while you were gone," Emily said in a small voice that broke Jack's heart. "They didn't try to come in, but they stood outside for a long time, and one of them waved at me through the window." Jack felt rage and terror compete for dominance in his chest as he realized how close he had come to losing everything that mattered to him. These people had not just threatened him, they had deliberately frightened a 10-year-old child as a way of demonstrating their reach and willingness to target innocents. "Did they say anything to you?" Emily shook her head, but her silence spoke volumes about how thoroughly the encounter had shaken her. Jack gathered his daughter in his arms, feeling her small body tremble against his chest as she finally allowed herself to show her fear. "We're going to go somewhere safe," he told her, his voice steady, despite the fury raging inside him. "Pack a bag with your favorite things. We're going to stay with Uncle Mike for a few days." Mike Rodriguez had been Jack's best friend since high school, and his apartment in Brooklyn represented the closest thing to a safe house that Jack could arrange on short notice. More importantly, Mike was a former Marine who understood both the importance of protecting family and the practical realities of dealing with dangerous people. As they packed their essential belongings, Jack explained the situation to Emily, in terms she could understand without going into details that would terrify her further. They were helping a friend who was in trouble, and that meant some bad people were angry with them, but they would stay with Uncle Mike until the police could make everything safe again. Emily accepted this explanation with the resilience of childhood, though Jack could see the strain in her eyes. She was old enough to understand that their comfortable life had been shattered by forces beyond their control, but young enough to still believe that adults could fix anything if they tried hard enough. The drive to Mike's apartment felt like the longest of Jack's life, every car behind them a potential threat. Every red light an opportunity for ambush. But they arrived safely, and Mike's warm embrace provided the first moment of genuine security Jack had felt since walking into Romano's the night before. "You did the right thing, brother," Mike said, as he helped them carry their bags upstairs. "But now we need to make sure you live long enough to see it through." Mike's apartment was small but defensible, with good sight lines and multiple exit routes that came from his military training and natural paranoia. More importantly, it was unknown to Meridian Industries, giving them a temporary refuge while they planned their next moves. That evening, as Emily slept on Mike's couch, the three adults sat around the kitchen table planning their approach to the FBI. Mike's military experience provided valuable insights into how federal investigations worked, while Jack's first-hand knowledge of the threats they faced added urgency to their timeline. "The key is getting into federal protection before Meridian realizes you're planning to testify," Mike explained. "Once you're in the system, they'll have a much harder time reaching you. But until then, you're completely vulnerable." Sarah had arranged to meet them at the federal building first thing Monday morning, giving them a weekend to prepare their testimony and gather any additional evidence. But as Jack looked at his sleeping daughter, he wondered if they would live long enough to see Monday dawn. The attack came Sunday evening, just as Jack was beginning to believe they might actually make it to their FBI appointment safely. He was helping Emily with homework at Mike's kitchen table when the apartment's front window exploded inward in a shower of glass and smoke. The concussion grenade was designed to disorient rather than kill, but in the confined space of the apartment, its effects were devastating. Jack found himself on the floor, his ears ringing and his vision blurred, while Emily's screams seemed to come from a great distance. Through the smoke and confusion, he could see figures moving with military precision, advancing through the apartment with weapons drawn and faces covered by tactical masks. These were not the same men from Romano's, these were professionals, equipped and trained for exactly this kind of operation. Mike appeared from the bedroom, his own pistol in hand, but he was quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. Jack watched helplessly as his best friend was forced to the ground and zip-tied, his military training useless against opponents who had come prepared for resistance. Jack struggled to his feet, desperate to reach Emily, who was cowering behind an overturned chair with tears streaming down her face. But strong hands grabbed him from behind, forcing him to his knees as cold metal pressed against the back of his neck. "Where are the documents?" The voice was professionally neutral, betraying no emotion or hesitation. "We know Collins gave you copies. Tell us where they are, and your daughter doesn't have to watch you die." Jack's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out of their situation. Sarah had not given him any documents, those remained in her possession, hidden somewhere that Meridian had not yet discovered. But these men clearly believed otherwise, which meant Sarah had somehow managed to convince them that Jack was a more valuable target than she was. "I don't have any documents," Jack said, his voice steady, despite the gun at his head. "Sarah Collins didn't give me anything except her phone number." The pressure of the gun barrel increased, and Jack could hear Emily's quiet sobbing from across the room. "You're lying. Our intelligence indicates you met with Collins this afternoon and left with a briefcase." Jack realized that Sarah had been under surveillance, and their meeting at the coffee shop had been observed and misinterpreted. These men believed he possessed the evidence that could destroy their organization, making him a priority target for elimination. "Search the apartment," the voice commanded, and Jack watched as trained operatives began methodically tearing apart Mike's home in search of documents that did not exist. Every drawer was emptied, every surface examined, every possible hiding place explored with ruthless efficiency. Emily had gone silent, which worried Jack more than her tears had. He could see her small form huddled behind the chair, and he prayed that she was simply too frightened to make noise rather than hurt in some way he could not detect. "Nothing here," one of the searchers reported after 20 minutes of systematic destruction. "Either he's telling the truth, or the documents are stored elsewhere." Jack felt the gun barrel withdraw from his neck, but before he could feel relief, a gloved hand grabbed his hair and yanked his head back. Looking down at him was a face covered by a black tactical mask, but the eyes were cold and professional in a way that suggested this was not the first time he had been in this situation. "Here's what's going to happen," the masked figure said. "You're going to call Collins and arrange another meeting. You're going to tell her you need those documents for your own protection. And when she shows up, we're going to resolve this situation permanently." Jack understood the implications immediately. They wanted him to betray Sarah, to lure her into a trap where she could be eliminated along with the evidence she possessed. His cooperation would buy temporary safety for Emily and himself. But it would doom the woman who had already risked everything to expose the truth. "And if I refuse?" The masked figure gestured toward Emily's hiding place. "Your daughter has a long life ahead of her. It would be a shame if she spent it in foster care, because her father made poor choices." The threat was delivered with casual efficiency, but its impact hit Jack like a physical blow. These people were not just threatening to kill him. They were promising to destroy Emily's entire future if he did not comply with their demands. Jack looked across the room at his daughter, seeing her small face peering around the edge of the overturned chair. In her eyes, he could see fear and confusion, but also trust, the absolute faith that her daddy would find a way to make everything okay. "I'll make the call," Jack said quietly, hating himself even as the words left his mouth. "But I need guarantees that Emily won't be harmed." "Complete cooperation earns complete protection," the masked figure replied. "Betrayal earns consequences. The choice is yours." As Jack reached for his phone, he caught Mike's eye across the room. His friend was bound and helpless, but there was something in his expression that suggested this was not over. Mike had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan by never giving up, never accepting defeat even when the odds seemed impossible. The phone call to Sarah was the hardest thing Jack had ever been forced to do. Her voice was bright with relief when she answered, clearly grateful to hear from him after a day of fear and uncertainty. "Jack. Thank God you're okay. I was starting to worry that something had happened to you and Emily." "We need to meet," Jack said, hating the deception but seeing no alternative. "Tonight. I think we're both in immediate danger, and I need those documents you mentioned." There was a pause, and Jack could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath as she processed the urgency in his voice. "What's happened? You sound strange." Jack felt the gun barrel press against his neck again, a silent reminder of the consequences of deviation from the script. "I can't explain over the phone. Can you meet me at the parking garage where we talked yesterday?" 1 hour? "Jack, this doesn't feel right." "Something in your voice. Are you in trouble?" The question hung in the air like a lifeline, offering Jack a chance to warn her without directly violating his captor's demands. But before he could respond, the masked figure pressed a button on his phone, ending the call with brutal finality. "Good enough," the figure said. "She'll come. They always do when they think they're saving someone." Jack wanted to protest, to explain that Sarah was too smart to walk into an obvious trap, but he held his tongue. Let these criminals underestimate her intelligence and caution. Perhaps their overconfidence would create an opportunity for escape or rescue. The next hour passed with agonizing slowness as the masked operatives prepared their ambush. Jack and Emily were moved to a back bedroom and placed under guard, while the others positioned themselves around the apartment. Mike remained in the living room, his military bearing intact, despite his restraints. Through the thin walls, Jack could hear his captors discussing their plans with clinical detachment. Sarah would be allowed to enter the building, then taken when she reached the apartment door. Her death would be staged to look like a robbery gone wrong, while Jack and Emily would simply disappear, becoming statistics in the missing persons files that would never be solved. As the appointed time approached, Jack found himself praying for the first time in years. Not for his own salvation, but for Emily's safety and Sarah's wisdom. If there was any justice in the universe, these criminals would not be allowed to complete their evil work unopposed. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside Mike's apartment brought sudden tension to the waiting operatives. Jack could hear them moving into position, weapons ready, as their intended victim approached what they believed would be her final moments. But instead of a knock on the door, the building suddenly erupted with the sounds of organized chaos. Boots pounded on stairs, voices shouted commands, and the distinctive crack of flashbang grenades echoed through the structure like thunder. FBI, federal agents. The words hit Jack's captors like a physical blow, their professional composure dissolving into panic as they realized their carefully planned operation had been compromised. Through the bedroom door, Jack could hear frantic radio chatter as the masked figures tried to coordinate an escape that was already impossible. Sarah had not walked into their trap after all. Instead, she had brought the full weight of federal law enforcement down on Meridian Industries' hired killers, turning their ambush into their own capture. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity as FBI agents swarmed through the apartment, securing the scene and taking the masked operatives into custody. Jack found himself being checked for injuries by a paramedic while Emily clung to his side, her small body shaking with relief and residual fear. Sarah appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 federal agents, her face showing a mixture of relief and guilt as she saw that Jack and Emily were safe. "I'm so sorry," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "When you called, I knew something was wrong. The way you said my name, the tone of your voice. I called the FBI immediately." "How did you find us?" Jack asked, amazed at the speed and precision of the federal response. "We've been tracking Meridian's communications since Sarah came forward this morning," one of the agents explained. "When their people activated tactical gear in this neighborhood, we knew exactly where to look." Jack learned that Sarah had indeed gone to the FBI first thing that morning, armed with her documents and testimony about Meridian Industries' criminal activities. Her evidence had been compelling enough to launch an immediate investigation, complete with surveillance teams and tactical units standing by for exactly this kind of situation. The masked operatives, stripped of their professional anonymity, turned out to be a mixture of former military contractors and private security personnel with extensive criminal records. Under federal interrogation, they quickly revealed the scope of Meridian's operations and the names of everyone involved in the conspiracy. Mike was released from his restraints, with multiple apologies from the federal agents, though his apartment would remain a crime scene for several days while evidence was collected. He accepted the disruption with characteristic grace, more concerned about Jack and Emily's welfare than his own inconvenience. "You did good, brother," Mike told Jack as they prepared to leave with their federal escorts. "You stood up when it mattered, and you protected your little girl. That's all any man can do." The federal agents arranged secure housing for Jack and Emily while the investigation continued, explaining that although the immediate threat had been neutralized, Meridian Industries still had resources and connections that could pose ongoing danger. Sarah was placed in the Federal Witness Protection Program, her testimony too valuable and her knowledge too comprehensive to risk any possibility of retaliation. Over the following weeks, Jack watched from his protected location as the Meridian Industries scandal unfolded across national media. Sarah's evidence proved to be the key that unlocked a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of corporate and political power, leading to dozens of arrests and congressional investigations that would continue for years. The 2 men who had originally threatened Sarah at Romano's were among the first to be arrested, their connections to the broader conspiracy making them priority targets for federal prosecutors. Marcus Donnelly and Vincent Torres, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of life in prison, chose to cooperate with investigators rather than protect their former employers. Emily adapted to their temporary living situation with remarkable resilience. though Jack could see that the experience had changed her in fundamental ways. She was more serious now, more aware of the complexities and dangers of the adult world, but also more confident in her father's ability to protect her when it mattered most. "Will we ever get to go home?" she asked one evening as they sat in their secure apartment, watching news coverage of the latest Meridian arrests. Eventually, Jack promised, though he knew their old life was gone forever. The events at Romano's had thrust them into a larger story that would follow them for years to come. "But wherever we end up, we'll be together, and we'll be proud of what we did." The federal prosecutors eventually offered Jack a choice. Enter witness protection permanently with a new identity in a new city, or accept a substantial financial settlement in exchange for agreeing to testify at trial while maintaining his current identity. After consulting with Emily, who surprised him with her mature analysis of their options, Jack chose to testify. The trial of Meridian Industries executives became one of the most closely watched corporate criminal cases in recent history. Jack's testimony about the restaurant incident provided a human face to the abstract financial crimes, while Sarah's evidence supplied the detailed proof of systematic corruption that prosecutors needed for conviction. Standing in the federal courthouse, raising his right hand to swear that his testimony would be the truth, Jack thought about the simple question that had started it all. "Daddy, can we help her?" In answering yes to that question, he had discovered reserves of courage he never knew he possessed, and had taught his daughter lessons about justice and compassion that no amount of money could buy. The jury deliberated for 6 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against the Meridian executives. The sentences ranged from 20 years to life in prison, effectively dismantling an organization that had operated with impunity for decades. Sarah emerged from witness protection to testify at the sentencing hearing, her words carrying the weight of someone who had risked everything to expose the truth. She spoke about the importance of ordinary people finding the courage to stand up against corruption, even when the personal cost seemed overwhelming. After the trial concluded, Jack and Emily were free to return to their normal lives, though they discovered that their definition of normal had expanded considerably. The financial settlement from the government allowed Jack to start his own construction company, while Emily's experience had inspired her to pursue a career in law enforcement. "I want to help people like that lady," she explained when asked about her future plans. "I want to make sure bad people can't hurt innocent families." Jack found himself in demand as a speaker at conferences and events focused on corporate accountability and citizen involvement in combating corruption. He never felt comfortable with the attention, but he understood the importance of sharing his story as an example of how ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when circumstances demanded it. Sarah stayed in touch, their shared experience creating a bond that time and distance could not diminish. She had taken a position with a federal agency dedicated to investigating financial crimes, using her expertise to prevent other companies from following Meridian's path. On the anniversary of the Romano's incident, Jack and Emily returned to New York for a private ceremony honoring the FBI agents who had saved their lives. Standing in the federal building where the investigation had been coordinated, Jack reflected on how a single moment of moral clarity had transformed their quiet existence into something larger and more meaningful. Emily, now 11 and increasingly confident in her own moral compass, stood beside her father as they received commendations for their role in exposing one of the most significant corporate corruption cases in recent history. When asked by reporters what advice she would give to other children facing difficult moral choices, her answer was simple and direct. "Ask yourself if you're helping or hurting," she said with the gravity of someone much older. "If you're helping, then you're probably doing the right thing, even if it's scary." Jack watched his daughter speak to the assembled media with pride and amazement, recognizing in her words the same instinctive compassion that had prompted her original question about helping a stranger in distress. The little girl who had asked Daddy, "Can we help her?" had grown into a young woman who understood the power and responsibility that came with standing up for others. As they left the federal building and walked out into the busy New York streets, Jack realized that their story had come full circle. They had started as ordinary people living quiet lives, been thrust into extraordinary circumstances by their decision to help someone in need, and emerged as examples of how individual courage could triumph over institutional corruption. The restaurant where it all began had closed permanently, unable to recover from the negative publicity associated with the Meridian case. But in its place, a small memorial garden had been planted, dedicated to the principle that ordinary citizens have both the power and the responsibility to stand up against injustice whenever they encounter it. Emily insisted on visiting the garden every time they came to New York, leaving small flowers and reading the inscription that had been carved into a simple stone bench. "In recognition of all those who choose courage over comfort when confronted with others' suffering." The inscription captured perfectly the choice that Jack had made that night at Romano's, though he still did not think of himself as particularly heroic. He had simply been a father who wanted to teach his daughter the difference between right and wrong, and who had discovered that sometimes the most important lessons are taught through actions rather than words. Years later, when Emily graduated from the FBI Academy and took her oath as a federal agent, Jack sat in the audience remembering the scared little girl who had once asked if they could help a stranger in distress. The woman she had become was proof that individual acts of courage, no matter how small they might seem at the time, could ripple outward to change the world in ways that were impossible to predict or measure. The question, "Daddy, can we help her?" had been asked in innocence and answered with determination. Its consequences had transformed 2 lives, exposed vast corruption, and demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful force for justice is simply the willingness of ordinary people to do what they know is right, regardless of the personal cost. In the end, Jack realized, that was the most important lesson of all, not that heroes are born, but that they are made in moments when good people choose to act rather than look away. Emily had understood this instinctively at age 10, and her father had been wise enough to listen when she reminded him that helping others is always worth the risk.